What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In this video I'm going to show you how I made this picture frame. This is primarily curly maple. It's really light figured curly maple, but it's got a little curl to it. And it's bordered in walnut all the way around and then through the miter as well. This was slightly interesting. I've never quite done a miter detail quite like this before. It really wasn't all that complicated, but it did take some math and a little bit of planning ahead to figure out exactly how I was going to get these cut. So anyway, follow along. We'll see how we do this thing. Okay, so time for a little math lesson. Doing a typical picture frame, you've got a 1/4 inch rabbet that would come inside here, and you know just from some simple math you can find out what your distance is from this point to the other point down at the other end. But because this picture frame's a little bit more complicated than that, I had to do a bit more math beyond that. So what I've got drawn out here crudely is the basic layout of this picture frame, specifically the mitered corner. So the center strip here is going to be the curly maple, and this strip here and strip here is going to be the walnut. If these just came to the end here and I didn't have to worry about this center bit of walnut here, the math is simple. I just stick them on there, cut to the corners, call it a day. But because I'm adding this little strip here in the middle here, it complicates things. And it goes even further because if I just made this one solid strip and glued it in between these two pieces, I'd have to hand cut this mitered corner right here, or hand cut this notch out, and then do the same thing on the back side for the rabbet. So I don't want to do that. I've done it before, and it's quite the hassle. I think doing this is going to show a lot more craftsmanship into it than just simply sticking something together and doing like an arts and crafts type build. Here's where it gets complicated. This is 3/8 and that's 3/8. And this dimension here from here to here is 3/8 as well, but I got to split that in half. So now they're 3/16 and 3/16. I'm running this on an angle, so if I just cut 3/16 of an inch here, it actually make this wider than it should be. Or actually, I'm sorry, make it narrower than it should be. So I got to do is I got to figure out how long is this distance from here to here. So you go back to high school algebra, they taught you what's called the Pythagorean Theorem, or I think I'm pronouncing that right. Anyway, what it says is that if you take a right angled triangle and you take these two sides that are perpendicular to each other and you go a squared plus b squared, those two numbers added up gives you the square root of this side here. So it's a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So I know that this is 3/16 of an inch, and by default this should be 3/16 of an inch. So 3/16 squared plus 3/16 squared gives me a total of 17/64 from there to there. So I just have to multiply that by 2 and I get 17/32. So when I cut right here and down at the other end, I'm going to cut 17/32 of an inch shorter than the overall finished thing. Then all I got to do is add on this 3/8 piece, or I'm sorry, this 3/16 inch thick piece of walnut to the end of it, and then just finish off taking these ends down, and that'll get me to my final measurement. So now it's off to making some sawdust. Okay, so a little problem. In order to cut that strip of walnut down to 3/8 of an inch thick, you would normally just set your fence, distance from your blade, however thickness of piece you want to cut. Problem here, 3/8 of an inch thick doesn't give me a whole lot of room to work with here. The cutout here in this plate's pretty large. That doesn't leave me a lot of meat here, and then there's no way I'm getting the push stick through here to cut this, and I dang sure ain't doing it by hand. So what I'm going to do instead is set up a thin rip gauge. And these are pretty simple. You can buy them that are pre-made, or you can make something like I've done here. So this is my poor man's thin rip gauge, and it works pretty well. So what I've got is a piece of T-track slot left over from when I made my router table over there. Quick little hold down with the hand screw on top of it, and then a scrap piece of wood. So what you do is you grab you a ruler like this, remember, and you measure from the edge of this piece here, edge of your piece of wood, to the tooth here. So then you take your stock, set it down up against your fence, and then you start moving the fence and the stock over at the same time until they just touch. Now you don't want to bind on there because you want to be able to move this out of the way. So I'm going to cut it just a little bit fat. Now when you push it through here, it's going to take off 3/8 of an inch from this side here over to this edge of the blade. The next cut around, now this piece is skinnier, all you got to do is loosen up your fence, move it on over, line it back up to the edge of your gauge here, rip it again. Well, I should have known that last one wasn't going to work. What I was trying to do was run it down far enough and then flip it over and then take it back off, because the blade is dang near up against the fence here. There may be a 64th of an inch in there, if that. So what I'm going to do is glue this up to one of those pieces and then just send it down the table saw one more time to clean up this one side and make it 3/8 of an inch thick. Alright, so glue up time. Because these things are so narrow, I can get away with just sticking them all on the same glue up. I just got to remember not to glue up these two pieces together. I've done that before doing cutting boards, making strips, and it's really embarrassing when you do that, because you go take it out of the clamps, you're like, wait a minute, this thing's supposed to be two pieces. Why isn't it? And then you got to think back, what did you do wrong? And anyway, so all I got to do is just pull these two out and throw glue on either side, land back in, clamp it all together. So. Alright, so the pieces are now out of the clamps, and went ahead and off camera just cut the ends of it off, and then I trimmed up that one side down the down the table saw. And while I was doing that, I started taking a look at these things to make sure that they were nice and square and plumb all the way down. And I noticed that there's a little tiny curve in one of them. And not only that, but the strips are just a hair over 3/8 of an inch wide, as well as the maple is just a touch over 1.25 inches. So while I have a little bit of meat here to play with on these things, and they've got a little bit of a warp in them, I'm going to stick them back down the planer and on the joiner to make them nice and dead true. And that way when I go into making the frame, I don't have to worry about the miter being off just a little bit here and then having to finesse that later. So if I can get these things dead square now while I still have a little bit of material left on them to work with, it's a good time to go ahead and do it. So off to the joiner and the planer. These pieces are now been run through the planer at least once on the face and on the one edge, so they're nice and square. Problem is that the planer put a slight taper in this edge, so at one end it's just a smidge under 3/8, and the other end it's at 3/8 or just a touch over. So now that I've got at least a square, I've got to take the taper out of it, trying to bust out the plane. And while they were gluing up, I went ahead and sharpened up this blade, so it is making some super fine shavings. So anyway, so I'm going to use that to make sure that this side here is, at least that strip of walnut anyway, is parallel all the way down and uniform with both pieces. Once I get this one side done, then I can run it down the table saw to square up the other side and get it to the correct dimension as well. So off we go. Strip down the planer is done, so now I've got a flat back, flat face, and a flat edge, and this one side has been taken down to just under 3/8 of an inch, and it's plumb all the way, or it's parallel to the maple strip all the way down. All right, so now to kick on the table saw, rip this one edge down to make it plumb, and then we'll move over to the miter jig to get these miters cut. Alrighty, so these pieces are now trued up on all sides, and all I got to do now is cut them down to length and get these miters going. So in order to do that, I got a miter sled here that I made using some directions from a gentleman by the name of William Ing. He's been a woodworker and teacher for a very, very long time. He's got some excellent videos here on YouTube. I'll leave a link below to 2 of his videos. The first video is how he makes his crosscut sled and how to get it dead accurate. And we're talking within 1/1000th of an inch over a 20-inch run. So super, super accurate jig. So in order to make this miter jig, you're going to need that crosscut sled first. So if you already have a really accurate crosscut sled, you can just skip to the second video where you make the miter sled. If you don't have the crosscut jig that he showed you how to make, you need to make one. It is hands down the best jig that I have ever made. It is super, super accurate. And it really made a world of difference in all of my picture frames and boxes and generally anything that needs to be cut very, very accurately. So check those links below, watch that, and then come back here and you'll see how to cut these things. Okie dokie. So the first miter has been cut, and as you can see, it makes a really, really smooth cut. Very, very little tear out. It's just really just a light fuzz right across here, and that's another added benefit of having one of these sleds, is that you basically end up with a 0 clearance insert on your table saw for doing these miters. So when you're dealing with woods like cherry or pine or something like that really love to chip out on the back cut, on the back side of the cut, this thing will save you a whole lot of sanding and a lot of headaches. So +1 for the miter gauge. Now that this end's cut, all I got to do is transfer my measurement down here to the other end. So we're going to cut one of the long sides first. So it's 13.5 inches down here to this end. But I need to take off 17/64 of an inch. So, as I was doing this, it just dawned on me that I'm cutting to 17/64 of an inch difference, but that's only for one side. So I need to recut this one an additional 17/64 and take off 17/32 like I was supposed to do the first time on this one and the other two. So even math can fail you sometimes. So the sides of the frame are all finished up. They're cut to length. It's perfectly square. All the miters match up perfectly. There's no gaps on either end on the inside or the outside edges. So I've done my job good so far. Now I got to glue up these little strips of walnut to the sides here. Now currently these are still 3/8 of an inch wide. And I'm leaving them thick because trying to glue up a 3/16 inch piece here is going to get really flexible, and it's going to be difficult to make a solid contact all the way across this surface. Once they're glued on, I'll stick them back on the miter sled and cut this side just like we did before, except this time make sure I'm cutting this strip down to 3/16 of an inch. Let's get some glue on this stick here and stick it together.
So these pieces are now dried up, so now all I gotta do is just trim off these ends a little bit. Then I'm gonna hit it with the hand plane to make them nice and smooth and flush to the surface. Then it's over to the table saw to cut out the dados. I'm gonna do the dados first. That way when I do this, that way if there's any tear out from the dado, it's on this piece that's gonna get cut off anyway, so. Well, got all these cut. The camera, for whatever reason, didn't record any of these miters being cut, but process was the exact same as it was before when we were just cutting the ends of the maple. So now back to the table saw, get the dados out, and get this rabbit cut. Alrighty, so the dados are all cut. Now it's time to put this thing together. So instead of trying to use a jig or some other type of clamping system, I'm going to use the cheapest jig that I have in the shop, painter's tape. Now, if you've never done this, you're already thinking there's no way in hell this is going to work. How in the hell are you going to tape a joint together and it be clamped up and hold tight? Well, it works, and it works incredibly well. So, take a piece of tape. Doesn't take a really long piece of tape to do this, but you don't want to go with a super short piece either. Now there's multiple ways of laying these things out. This is just the way that I'm used to doing it. Try to get it on there as straight as you can with that piece of tape. Alright, get it nice and stuck down on there. Take your next piece and set it right up against it. And then lay it on down on there. Alright. Now slide that over and do your next one. There we go. Alright. Now because I don't have a really long surface in here, I can only lay out 3 pieces at a time. Once this gets folded up, it's going to want to hang there by itself. You'll see here in just a second. So, alright. Now let's put some glue in here. You don't want to get carried away with the glue here. Also important, you don't put a lot of glue up here by the inside edge of the miter joint, because if you get squeeze out here, you're gonna have a real hard time cleaning that off. So here comes the great part about using this, is that all you gotta do is pick this up, throw that one together, throw that one together. Stand it up. Pull it down, throw the tape over the edge. Voila. Alrighty, so now the frame is out of the tape and came out really good. The joints are all really tight. They're closed on both sides, so the frame's not twisted one way or the other. One tip when you're doing something like this is if you're doing like a picture frame or something that doesn't have a very thick cross section like this across the miter joint, sometimes the weight of the material that you're working with will cause the ends of the miters to dip in or dip up because it's not setting flat because you got tape behind it or something like that. So what can happen is the back of the miter might be open and the top side would be closed. So to prevent that from happening, do your tweaking with it flat as best you can, but don't let it set that way. Tip it up and set it up on its edge, so what will happen is your joints won't be exposed to pressure one way or the other, and you should get a fully closed miter joint all the way through. This one here, as I was working with it, the top of the joints were looking just fine, but when I turned it over, I noticed the back sides were opening up a little bit. So I just stood it up on its edge, gave it a little bitty tweak while the glue was still wet, and let it set up overnight. Next morning I come out, and here it is. Perfect miter joints. So now I just need to clean up the tops of these miters just a touch. Some of them are really close. There's a couple of them that are just a tiny little bit off, but a little bit of work with the hand plane and maybe a card scraper will clean these up just fine. And then it's over to the router table to get the slight little bevels on the inside and outside corners taken care of.
So the router's done, and the only thing I got left to do now is just clean up this little tiny corner here where the router couldn't get into, and I'll just do that with a chisel. Then we get into actually finishing this thing with maybe a little bit of card scraper to get some of these hand plane lines out of here, and shot with 120 and then 220, and I think I'm going to finish this thing in armor seal. This stuff's really good. It's just a wipe on polyurethane finish, and super smooth, not crazy durable, but for a picture frame you don't really need it to be. So alright, so time to start sanding. So I'm going to start with some 120 grit and then move up to 220, and then we can start putting on the finish. So that's it for sanding. Anyway, let's bust out this armor seal, wipe it down, get this dust off of it, clean up this workspace, and get to it. Well dang, I almost forgot the most important part. Always sign your work. Definitely want to do this before I start putting the finish on, because the this thing is so hot it'll boil the finish and burn it as well. And because these letters on here are really, really close together, there's so much heat concentrated around them that it ends up burning the wood around the letters instead of right where you're making contact. So you have to do some finish sanding after you do this. So definitely want to get this done before I go too far. So get this thing lit up. Come on now. Work. Alright, time to put this finish on and see how this is going to work. So here we go. Yeah, that's going to look pretty dang good. I can't say enough about this stuff. I'll put a link down below to a couple different places to get this. I think you can just walk into any Woodcrafters and pick this up right away. And if you've never used it, I encourage you to go out and get you a pint of it and give it a whirl. I've had this can for God knows how long, and it goes a very, very long ways. You can do a ton of projects with just a can like this. It's not crazy expensive at all, and it keeps very well. As long as you got that lid on there good, you're not going to have to worry about getting a crust over in the top here like you do with some polyurethanes. At least I haven't had it happen with this stuff. So, yeah, there you go. So it's the next morning and this thing is pretty well done. Generally what I'll do after this is I'll take some paste wax or furniture wax and just give this thing a nice buff down all the way around. It gets rid of any slight dust that may be sitting on the surface of this thing, and it really smooths up the finish quite well. So moving forward, to get this thing finished, got to put on the hardware. Something about that just don't look right. Oh, that's why. Some odd reason I was thinking 4.5 was the middle of 8. That is not the case. I wonder why that didn't look right. There we go. Alright, now let's stick a hole in this thing. And definitely want to be careful here and don't drill all the way through the dang picture frame. I've done that before. Turned out pretty good. Now all I need to do is just get it cleaned up, stick the glass in, put the backing in, and send this thing to its new home. There you have it. That's the picture frame. Went together really well. There are absolutely no gaps in the miter, front or back or on the ends. This might be one of the best mitered picture frames that I've done in quite some time. The only issue that I had was the picture frame glass that I got for this thing was a bit bigger than 8x10. It was almost a really fat 1/16 off on one side and just a hair over maybe 30 seconds on the other. It was enough to keep the glass from going into the frame. So after the final shots that you just saw, I had to take it back to the back here to the bench and come in with a chisel and take off just a really small amount on the inside of that rabbit. It's not something you're really going to see until you take this thing apart and put a picture in it. Then you're going to have to really stare at it and you can see it. Most people will never even notice it was there. So just a little bit of chisel work, quick shot with some sandpaper, and then just took a little bit more of that armor seal and just to clean up and seal that edge. Took care of the job. So it's maybe 5 minutes worth of work. So not a big deal, but it's something you need to be aware of if you're going to do a picture frame. If you already have your glass, measure that glass and make sure that it's actually an 8x10. If it's not, plan ahead and make your rabbit just a little bit wider. You don't have to make your dimensions on the exterior bigger. You just need to set the depth on your fence to cut that rabbit just a tiny bit deeper than 1/4 inch. So other than that, that's all there is to it. So it's a fun project. I hope you enjoyed this. If you haven't done so already, please hit that subscribe button, like the video, and share away too, please. Anyway, we'll see you next time. Thank you.